Now, when Jesus is questioned about marriage, he says some difficult things about divorce. And then he goes on to speak about those who cannot marry under the rules of the day. Now, the difficult things he says about divorce are that basically it should never happen. There's an exception put in one of the Gospels, but in the other Gospel that speaks of divorce, he says it should never happen. But there's a reason for this. But back in the days of Jesus, a woman could be divorced just by a man writing a writ of divorce in the heat of an argument or wanting something fresher and newer. And a divorced woman was like a widow. In the world in which they lived, she had no means of support whatsoever. There was begging on the street time. So Jesus' teaching on divorce primarily leads us to believe that he had a concern for women greater than a concern for the convenience of men. That equality between the genders was something he took sufficiently seriously to get himself in horrible trouble with the religious authorities, because remember, what he was saying went completely against not just what the Sanhedrin would be teaching, but against what the Old Testament teaches. We seem to forget this. When us as a community have the Old Testament walloped around our head repeatedly, we seem to forget that Jesus himself went against the Old Testament again and again in his teachings and in his life. Now, going against the Old Testament, you can mix that up with weasel words to make it look like he didn't actually go against it. But realistically, he did. He did. He broke the Mosaic law again and again and again. And he always broke that Mosaic law in the name of compassion, in the name of kindness. So here we go. If we look at Jesus' prime, the people Jesus surrounded himself with, not just as companions, not just to teach, but as people who actually took the message of Jesus and sent it elsewhere. Those who God chose as messengers, they were all what I would describe as queer. They were all other than heteronormative or societally normative. There was the women who, at the time, had no legal status at all, and whose word would never stand up in court, who were the people who were chosen to be those who bore testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. The only people who stuck around for the crucifixion were the women and the disciple whom Jesus loved. And if you've ever read the description of the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, you will realize that there is something very queer indeed about the disciple whom Jesus loved. There is something that was other than what was expected about the closeness of that relationship. And then we see people like the Ethiopian Eunuch, who was sent out as the advocate of the way of Jesus to the people of a whole continent, who was very much other than the Hebrew Jesus and the people who they surrounded themselves with. He was somebody who would have been exiled under Hebrew rules, who would not have been allowed into the people of God, who would not have been allowed into the temple, who would not have been allowed into temple worship. He was, like many of us, an outsider. Now, this is going to be uncomfortable because many of us desperately don't want to be outsiders. Much of the politics which is going on around the LGBT community today is desperately trying to be anything other than an outsider. It is buying into everything that's being offered, whether it's any good or not. It is saying, please, please let us in, and we'll forget all the nonsense which you've pushed in our direction. Please let us in, and we'll stop being a nuisance. Please let us in, and we'll try our best not to be quite so uncomfortable for you, not to be quite so different. So we as a community will start turning our back upon those who can't pass. We'll start turning our back upon those who are flaming, upon those who are embarrassing, upon those who are have a different concept of what sexual liberation means. We'll start getting snotty about people who live pretty much like gay people have lived for hundreds of years. And we will start deciding that there is only one way to be gay in this new world where we are accepted by the self-appointed powers that be, and that way to be gay will be anything other than queer. Despite the fact that we as people of faith see that this queerness is something that God values, because it is contrary to the world. Cosmos, that word, that societal creation which is decried so frequently in the Bible, which is held up as being something that you have to avoid like the plague. And here we are as a community desperately trying to buy into the world and everything it involves. Now, this is uncomfortable listening, and I've been kind of rearing myself up for it during the whole sermon, thinking, dare I say this? I think, yeah, I do need to say it, because, you know, MCC is fundamentally very queer.
Yes.
People still come to MCC expecting it not to be, and are surprised when it is.
Yes.
Now, you can always, with a little bit of effort and with the right jiggery-pokery, make a big, shiny church if you avoid the queer thing. And some churches have been very successful at that.
Yes.
But it still means that there are going to be a whole bunch of people who are left outside, and MCC exists so that nobody is left outside.
Sad.
Consequently, we have to embrace this notion of queerness, because MCC is fundamentally that queer church. Doesn't mean to say it's exclusively that, it's a lot of other things as well. And there is a place within MCC for everybody. But it does mean that in enveloping and embracing everybody, we cannot abandon the very people we were set up to serve.
Amen.
We cannot abandon the queer, the embarrassing, the bathhouse addicts, the drag queens, the sisters of perpetual indulgence. We cannot abandon these people who are giving living testimony to their difference under God.
Sad.
Inclusion or exclusion is not down to whether we are uncomfortable or not. We have to accept people. I don't care if they make you uncomfortable. You're going to have to work on that. You're really going to have to work on that. Because I'll tell you what, there is no goddamn reason why anybody should change their life, which they live in 365 days a year, just because you are made uncomfortable.
Say it.
You're only going to see them occasionally.
Come on.
They're stuck in that body, in that life, in that soul.
Yes.
It's our business to embrace them as queer human beings, and for those of us who identify with it, to stand up proudly and say, I am queer as hell. I am very peculiar indeed. Thank you. Oh Lord, that really was what I wanted to preach. Amen.
Say it.
That was what I wanted to preach. Because Isaiah tells us, and I will paraphrase here, let not the queer consider themselves a dry branch cut off from the tree of life, from the body of God. Let them know that God has another name for them, a name better than sons and daughters.
Yes.
A name better than sons and daughters. Because God shines upon the queer. John the Baptist was about as queer as you can get, and still be a functioning human being. I've met some people who are so queer they're almost incapacitated. I had a friend whose language was so affected he had to have it translated back to him. Say, oh, what did I say? You said this, dear. These are causes for celebration, because you know, the people who really change the world, who inspire movements and inspire artistic movements, they're not Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs from Lake Elsinore. They're just not. They are strange and rich and inspiring and peculiar people. They're challenging and threatening people. They're awkward people. They're people who make folk uncomfortable.
Yes.
I've grown up making people uncomfortable. I have.
Really?
Shut up. I've had to get used to it. And then after I got used to it, I tolerated it. And then after tolerating it for a while, I decided, well, I better celebrate it, haven't I? And I think that's really what we're about. Celebrate, not tolerate.
Right.
Celebrate people, not tolerate them. There is nothing more nasty than being tolerated. Nothing more unpleasant. You know,
right.
in this valley, and I may get into trouble for saying this, there are dozens of churches that will happily tolerate you, ladies and gentlemen. They will happily tolerate you. If you behave yourself, just as if you were like everybody else, they will tolerate you, they'll smile at you, they'll shake their hand, they'll give you a cup of coffee. But heaven forfend that you should actually start living like a gay person and doing gay things with gay partners and not behaving as if you were just like everybody else. If you don't go along with the expected model, then they can turn very nasty very quickly.
Yes.
Very nasty very quickly. But you know, we're not like that. We can't be like that. If we ever begin to get like that, we cease to exist. It's no pointless. Plenty of other churches that are doing, you know, the general thing. If we stop telling the truth, and if we stop embracing that which is other, then we lose our prophetic voice. Because the prophetic voice is fundamentally that which is other. It's a voice from outside. Because I'll be honest with you, from inside you can't speak because you're too compromised. My brothers and sisters who remain in the Church of England daren't open their mouths because they have been wound around by the fact that their stipend entirely depends upon them towing the line. They live in houses provided by the church and the bishop and on the sufferance of the bishop who tells them that they can't say this. Consequently, we always have to retain that distance so that we can speak the truth in love. Because if we sell our souls to this structure which isn't serving the people inside, let alone the people outside, we will have given up all that is unique and extraordinary and wonderful in ourselves, and we will have given it up for nothing. We will have sold our soul for a bag of beans which are never going to grow into a beanstalk.
Amen.
So, lest I carry on too long, let us embrace the message of today, which is about as clear as it can be. About as clear as it can be. And in a sane world, there would never be a question about gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender inclusion because of the very words that Jesus says. We have in the past given out a little booklet, which is blank. And at the beginning it says what Jesus said about homosexuality. I don't approve of that, because Jesus actually said quite a bit about homosexuality. And it was all positive. His words about the eunuch, his description of the centurion and the centurion's boy.
Yes.
The word pais doesn't mean servant, by the way. Never did mean servant, never has meant servant. It means something else entirely.
Yes.
Jesus did speak of us. Jesus spoke to us and to those who love us. Jesus spoke to the different, to those with an extraordinary and unique perspective. And Jesus says, you are well blessed. And Isaiah said, you will be given a name greater than sons and daughters. Amen.